The story of Jesus' resurrection is one of the central pillars of Christianity. It's often described as the ultimate proof of divine power, the event that validates everything else in the faith. But when we take a closer look at the sources, the picture becomes far more complicated. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't actually line up the way people often assume. They each tell the story with different details, different sequences, and in some cases, contradictory information. Let's start with something basic. Who went to the tomb? In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. In Luke, it's a larger group of women, including Joanna. In John, at least at first, it's only Mary Magdalene. Right away, we see that the most important witnesses aren't consistent across the accounts. If this event was so crucial, if it was literally the proof of the resurrection, why can't the authors even agree on who showed up? Next, what did they actually see when they arrived? In Matthew, there's a dramatic earthquake and an angel descending from heaven who rolls back the stone and sits on it. In Mark, they find the stone already rolled away, and inside the tomb sits a young man in white. In Luke, there are two men inside the tomb, shining like lightning. And in John, Mary Magdalene initially sees no one, then later sees two angels, and eventually Jesus himself outside. Each version has the same basic claim: the tomb is empty, but the surrounding details vary in ways that aren't easy to reconcile. Now, someone might say, well, eyewitnesses often describe events differently. That's true. When people see a car accident, they may recall different angles or details. But here's the thing. We're not talking about slight variations in description. We're talking about whether the stone was rolled away before the women arrived, or during an earthquake while they stood there. We're talking about whether there was one angel or two, inside the tomb or outside. These aren't small details. They fundamentally shape the story. And it doesn't stop there. Consider what happened afterward. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women right after they leave the tomb. In Luke, the women don't see Jesus at all. Instead, he appears later on the road to Emmaus and then to the disciples in Jerusalem. In John, Mary Magdalene meets Jesus at the tomb, but at first, she mistakes him for a gardener. In Mark's earliest version, the one scholars think is the most original, the story actually ends abruptly with the women fleeing in fear and telling no one. The later verses that describe Jesus appearing to his followers were added on later. This is important. The earliest version of the resurrection story, as preserved in Mark, has no appearances of Jesus after death. The women leave the tomb, terrified, and the story just ends there. Only later did other gospel writers expand it with dramatic encounters. That suggests we're not dealing with eyewitness testimony at all. We're dealing with stories that developed and grew over time, shaped by different communities with different needs. When you step back and look at these variations, the bigger question emerges. Why would a divine event, meant to be the cornerstone of faith, be left in such a contradictory state? If the resurrection actually happened, and if it was as earth-shattering as believers say, wouldn't the accounts be more consistent? Wouldn't there be more than a handful of disputed reports written decades later by people who weren't even there? Some point to Paul's letters, since he wrote earlier than the Gospels. Paul does talk about Jesus being raised, but notice this. He never mentions an empty tomb. He never tells stories about angels, earthquakes, or women visiting a grave. For Paul, the resurrection is a vision, an appearance, something experienced through revelation. In fact, he equates his own vision of Jesus with the appearances reported by the apostles. That's not a physical resurrection story. It's a spiritual experience. If Paul is our earliest source, then the bodily resurrection narrative seems like a later invention. This shift matters because it shows how religious stories evolve. At first, you have visions and revelations, subjective, internal experiences. Over time, those experiences are retold as physical events with concrete details. It's a way of making belief more tangible, more persuasive. A vision can be dismissed as imagination. An empty tomb and a risen body? That sounds like evidence, but it only works if people don't notice the contradictions. We also have to ask, what happens in real life when people strongly expect something? Psychological research shows that expectation can shape memory in dramatic ways. Entire groups can come to believe they saw or experienced something that never occurred. There are well-documented cases of false memories spreading among communities, reinforced by shared belief. The resurrection stories fit this pattern. Early Christians expected Jesus to return. They experienced visions, dreams, and powerful emotions. Those experiences became stories, and those stories eventually solidified into written gospels. Sociology also helps explain why the contradictions weren't a problem for early believers. In small, tight-knit groups, consistency isn't always necessary. What matters is that the story affirms identity and hope. For people under Roman rule, facing persecution and uncertainty, the claim that death itself had been defeated was more important than ironing out details. The resurrection became a rallying symbol, not a historical report. We can also look at how myths form in other cultures. Ancient religions often told resurrection stories, gods or heroes who died and returned. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Persia. These myths carried symbolic meaning about life, renewal, and the cycles of nature. Christianity didn't emerge in a vacuum. It borrowed from a world already filled with such stories. The resurrection of Jesus fits neatly into that pattern. What's unique is not the idea itself, but the way it became the foundation of a new religion. There's another angle worth considering: the silence of history. Outside the Gospels, there's no contemporary record of Jesus' resurrection. The Roman world kept extensive writings, and yet we find nothing about a crucified man who rose from the dead and appeared to crowds. Even the Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades later, only makes passing references. And those passages are widely debated as later Christian edits. If hundreds of people had truly witnessed a man conquer death, it would have been the most astounding event of the time. Yet outside the Christian movement, silence. So we're left with a set of conflicting stories, written years after the fact, by authors who never claimed to be eyewitnesses. We're left with contradictions about who went, what they saw, where Jesus appeared, and what he said. And we're left with a bigger question: why does faith still lean so heavily on this story when the foundation is so shaky? The answer lies in psychology and social power. Belief in resurrection answers a deep human fear: the fear of death. If someone conquered death once, then maybe we can too. That promise is powerful enough that people will hold on to it, even if the evidence doesn't hold up. Communities formed around it, institutions built on it, and eventually, entire civilizations were shaped by it. When we trace the story back, though, it becomes clear. What began as visions and expectations grew into legends, and those legends became gospel. Each gospel tells its version, tailored for its community, and over time, the contradictions were smoothed over in sermons and teachings. The power of the story wasn't in its factual accuracy, it was in its ability to inspire, to unify, and to promise something beyond the grave. But once we recognize this process, the story loses its grip. We can appreciate it as myth, as history of belief, without treating it as literal truth. And that recognition changes everything. It allows us to see the resurrection not as proof of divine intervention, but as an example of how human beings create meaning, shape memory, and build hope out of uncertainty. The Gospels don't reconcile because they weren't meant to. They reflect the diversity of early communities, each telling the story in a way that fit their own hopes and fears. They're not eyewitness accounts. They're theological expressions. And once we see that, the contradictions aren't just quirks. They're clues to the human origin of the story. When people say the resurrection is the best attested event in history, it's worth pausing. If 4 witnesses in a courtroom gave testimonies that contradicted each other on basic facts, no jury would call that solid evidence. Yet, when it comes to the resurrection, the same contradictions are reframed as complementary. But that's not how evidence works. The simplest explanation is also the most human one. These stories are legends, not history. And in a way, that makes them even more revealing. They show us how far people will go to hold on to hope, how stories can grow and change, and how belief can shape entire cultures. The resurrection isn't proof that a man came back from the dead. It's proof of something else: the power of human imagination, the hunger for meaning, and the ability of stories to endure, even when their details don't agree.